Mrs. Agnes Tynan, to her, inflation is a change in the way her family eats and in her social life. All farm development has stopped. To Jerry Traynor, it means not taking his wife out for 3 weekends while he saves for a new pair of spectacles. To Mrs. Grace Murphy, it means not going out so often, but also that she will only have a family of 2, all she can afford. To Lucy O'Brien, getting through college is that much tougher, with higher fees, canteen and book costs, and nobody from whom to claim more pay. To Sir Basil Goulding, higher costs eating into his capital and selling off land or paintings to keep up with expenses. To old age pensioners, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Miller, shopping around for cracked eggs and soft vegetables, or searching the streets for bits of coal. It was these 7 people who came together at our invitation to identify an acceptable solution to inflation. People of very different concerns, but all hit by inflation in their different ways. They would meet 2 economists, each of politically different camps. And these 2 economists would try to convince our 7 panellists of the merit of their solutions to inflation in the short term, rather as a politician would try to do at election time. But it will then be up to the panellists, all of different income levels, to hammer out between them which aspects of which economist proposals they find acceptable, and finally to produce their consensus programme of action on inflation. So theoretically, any solution they will produce in consensus should be politically acceptable to the rest of the country. But what will that programme of action be? First to put his plan of action on inflation to the panel, economist John Bristow of Trinity College, Dublin.
My first proposal would be for a fairly dramatic reduction, at least in the rate of growth of government expenditure. Also, I think the government may have to stop us trying to spend so much, so that I think may also require a fairly substantial increase in the amount of our incomes taken in tax. Now, either of these proposals are going to cause substantial hardship, more hardship to some sections of the community than to others. I think any cure of inflation, even learning to live with substantial inflation, requires quite considerable social adjustment, and we can't avoid that. Above all, I think this sort of proposal is going to cause significant unemployment, at least in the short term. I don't think we can avoid that. However, the amount of unemployment you have to live with if you want to accept a certain level of inflation is going to depend very much, I think, on what economists call the structure of the economy, particularly, if you like, how we use labour. And so I would look in the longer term to much more emphasis being given to manpower policy. In other words, to try and remove as far as possible pressures caused by bottlenecks of certain types of labour. Finally, it must be admitted in Ireland that a great deal of our inflation is caused from outside. And I think the only long-term solution to this sort of thing is at an international level to try and prevent major economies from generating inflation and then exporting it to us, and try and adopt international monetary systems which inhibit the transfer of inflation from one country to another.
Get back to the taxation thing, that you're not allowed enough for a wife and for a family, and there's an awful lot taxed off your salary, and it leaves very little. And if they do this taxation and level people out in jobs and this sort of thing, there'll be unemployment. We haven't got to spend at the moment if they were to control the wages. Now, they have done a wage freeze before.
Even less than you spend at the moment is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the only time I would be willing to listen anyway willingly to the word taxation is if Mr. Ryan and the other government ministers involved say, we're going to do something definite for the people that have to live in what I consider a twilight world. Then I might listen, but the government have to be definite.
It seems to me that what everybody has in mind is the relative thing, how he was off last year, how his neighbour is doing. And this is what I think John wants to arrest. He wants to stop all that relativity for a while.
We feel we're being taxed to the hilt as it is. If anything more is taken off, well, we can only go down in our standard of living, and having been used to a standard, no one wants to lose that.
Well, despite what...
Putting his programme of anti-inflation controls and action, economist Ian Goff of the University of Manchester.
Come to directly opposite conclusions about what should be done about it. So my proposals would fall into 2 parts. First of all, those necessary to protect the standard of living of the majority of the population of Ireland. These would include 1, a price freeze, a really effective price freeze, perhaps monitored by housewives, together with control of rents and land prices. Secondly, full index linking of all wages, transfer payments, pensions, grants and so forth, so that for every 1% that prices rose, these wages and benefits would also be raised by a full 1%. And there would need to be some control over the consumer price index, which at present doesn't accurately reflect the real cost of living. Thirdly, there would need to be protection of the social services, education and so forth, against the effects of inflation. And fourthly, a guarantee of full employment. But I would be being too simple if I thought these policies could be put forward in isolation. They will, of course, attack inequality, especially the incomes of the rich and profits. And to that extent, under our system, they would inevitably affect investment and employment. So as necessary corollaries of these, there would need to be a further set of proposals in the medium term. These would include, first of all, nationalisation of ailing industries and of key sectors in the economy, again under the control, wherever possible, of the workers and management in those firms. Secondly, overall planning of investment in the economy in the interests of growth and a regional balance. And lastly, and this would be very necessary, some control over foreign trade and the foreign capital markets, without which all the other proposals would come to naught.
John Bristow's proposal, I agreed with it in the classical sense that it would be acceptable in Ireland. From the social point of view, I wouldn't see the people of Ireland accepting a reduction in employment. The other proposal, I could not agree fully with total nationalisation, but I think that the nationalisation of our key resources such as mining would be important.
Index linking. I think this will be necessary for each 1% cost of living increases. Wages should increase 1%. Otherwise, we're just going to be worse off than we are at the moment.
So I also think that the price consumer index would have to be examined to take in housing into consideration. There could be no cutback in expenditure towards the social services. If anything, we'd have to pour some more money in there to keep them on an even keel.
I find that John Bristow's diagnosis of the fever, as you might call it, thoroughly sound. And I find thoroughly sound, therefore, the fact that medicine is what is needed. The trouble is that nobody likes medicine, everybody hates medicine, and everybody is resisting thoroughly the central point of the medicine, namely that their standard of living shall either not improve or perhaps disimprove really. Therefore, when you turn to Ian Gough's solution, it's much more attractive, and straight away the gloom lifts off every face around the room when you say, we don't have to bother anymore about the standard of living. He's made arrangements that everybody shall stay as it is or improve. In doing so, he puts all industry out of business. So on the whole, between the two, I think a slow progress by John's means rather than a quick one by Ian's.
Mr. Bristol said something about taxation going up. I don't think anybody'd like that because, they'd have less money, and then to give employment where it's needed. There's an awful lot of idle men, I suppose, going around, and women do want employment, and they should be made work if they want to.
Mr. Gough, I find his package extremely attractive. Nationalisation, prices freeze essential, along with the incomes freeze, etc. I think the people he'd have to convince there is the government. Well, we've come up with a consensus. I'd like everyone to bear in mind that this is something we haven't very much experience at. One, a rigid prices control, at least internally, allowing for rise in imports which are beyond our control. Any prices emanating from these imports and passed on to the consumer to be fully explained in the national dailies. This rigid prices control would be coupled with an incomes policy which will allow for these increases so that for every 1% increase to the consumer, wages would increase accordingly. A reappraisal of government spending so that it can be directed into more productive areas, such as the social services, aid to the old age pensioners, that type of thing. And we would like the government to step in and nationalise the sources of our mineral wealth and use the proceeds for the good of the nation rather than it going out of the country as at present.
How did the voting break down on that? Is that
there were 6 to 1 on this consensus. We had one disagreeing, Sir Basil, I think.
So Basil,
Had a
would
few
you care to
points.
add your...
But I think that many of these propositions are tenable, but I'd like to comment on 4. First, I think there should be that government spending should undergo a reduction in its rate of growth, a limitation in the rate of growth of government spending, a reduction in the rate of growth of money supply. Thirdly, when talk is made of an incomes policy, that all incomes, as wages and salaries, be controlled in relation to the cost of living, but by free negotiation and at a lesser rate than full indexation. And did you have the mining thing?
I had about, yes,
Yeah.
the mining.
And on mining, my resolution would be the government to obtain for the nation the maximum stake in Irish mining, which will not alienate the foreign participation which is necessary to activate it.